In August 1980, two field workers were tending crops in a cornfield along Seavers Road in Dixon, California, about 20 miles southwest of Sacramento. The summer heat was intense, the kind of oppressive warmth that made outdoor labor exhausting. As they moved through the rows of corn, they spotted something that didn't belong. Lying in the field was the body of a young woman. She had been shot multiple times in the head and neck. Despite the scorching heat of a California summer, she was wearing a green wool sweater. The incongruity of it, the wrongness of finding someone dressed for winter in the middle of August, made the scene even more unsettling. Law enforcement arrived and processed the scene. They photographed the body, collected evidence, searched for any clues that might tell them who this woman was and who had killed her. But the victim had no identification. There was nothing on her person that revealed her name, her age, where she came from, or why she had ended up dead in a cornfield in Solano County. She was listed as Jane Doe. For the next 12 years, she remained Jane Doe, an unknown victim of an unknown killer, buried without her name, mourned by a family who didn't even know she had been found. Somewhere across the country in New Jersey, Augustine and Sally Campiglia were living with an agony no parent should endure. Their daughter, Holly Ann, had gone missing in June 1980. She was 21 years old, adventurous, seeking her own path in life. Her mother would later recall that Holly either hitchhiked or took a bus when she left. The family filed a missing person report and waited. Days became weeks, weeks became months. There was no word from Holly, no sign of her, no answers, just silence. What the Campiglia family didn't know was that their daughter's name had been mistakenly removed from the National Missing Persons database just 2 weeks before her body was discovered in that California cornfield. It was a bureaucratic error, a clerical mistake that would keep a family in torment for over a decade. While Jane Doe lay in a California grave, the Campiglias searched for Holly, distributed flyers, made calls, contacted agencies, desperately trying to find out what had happened to their daughter. It wasn't until 1992, 12 years after Holly's death, that the connection was finally made. The National Missing Persons Unit contacted the Solano County Coroner's Office, and the pieces fell into place. Jane Doe was Holly Ann Campiglia. The young woman from New Jersey had somehow ended up in California, where she had been murdered and left in a cornfield. The Campiglias finally had an answer to one question, but it opened up countless others. How did Holly get to California? Who killed her? Why? And would they ever find justice? Sally Campiglia told reporters at the time something that revealed just how far from home Holly had been, both geographically and in the life she was living. When they sent Holly's body home, it would be the first time she had ever been on a plane. At least now they could bury their daughter properly, knowing her name, mourning her by name. But they still had no idea who had taken her life or why. The investigation continued, but without leads, without witnesses, without a suspect, the case eventually went cold. The evidence was carefully preserved. The file remained open, but as years passed without a breakthrough, the likelihood of solving Holly's murder seemed to diminish. The detective who had originally worked the case, Deputy Jose Cisneros, was killed in the line of duty in 1985. His death was its own tragedy, but it also meant that much of the institutional knowledge about Holly's case, the details and hunches that never make it into official reports, were lost with him. Decades passed. Holly's family never forgot her, never stopped hoping that one day they would have answers. Technology was advancing rapidly. DNA analysis, which had been in its infancy in 1980, was becoming increasingly sophisticated. In 2021, 41 years after Holly's murder, the Campiglia family made a decision. They reached out to the Solano County Sheriff's Office and requested that the department review Holly's case. They wanted to know if any of the original evidence could be resubmitted for additional DNA analysis using modern technology. The Sheriff's Office agreed. An evidence technician carefully retrieved items from the case, materials that had been stored for over 4 decades, waiting for the day when science might catch up to justice. The evidence was sent to the Serological Research Institute, known as SERI, a laboratory that specializes in advanced DNA testing. The lab used cutting-edge technology to examine the evidence, looking for genetic material that might have been impossible to detect or analyze back in 1980. Several months later, the sheriff's office received a report from SERI. Male DNA had been found on pieces of evidence from Holly's case. It was a significant development, but finding DNA was only the first step. The next question was whose DNA it was. The genetic profile was submitted to another database at the San Mateo Crime Lab in California. Technicians searched for a match, and they found one. The DNA belonged to someone who was already in the system, someone who was currently serving time in a California state prison for serious crimes. His name was Herman Lee Hobbs. Herman Lee Hobbs was 76 years old and had been serving behind bars for decades. He was serving a 25 years to life sentence for the 2000 rape of a 15-year-old girl in Yuba County. But that wasn't his only conviction. In 2005, he had been convicted of the 1975 rape and murder of 13-year-old Terry Pata. Terry had vanished while walking home from her school in Rio Linda, a suburb of Sacramento, in 1975. Several days later, her body was found stuffed in a drain pipe. She had been raped and stabbed to death. Hobbs had evaded justice for that crime for 30 years before DNA evidence finally connected him to Terry's murder. But there was more. A probation report submitted during one of Hobbs's trials indicated that he was a suspect in at least 5 other killings. In 2001, he had been charged with the murder of 29-year-old Brenda Ann Tucker, who went missing from her home in Oroville in 1994. Loggers discovered her skull with a bullet hole in it in Yuba County in 2001. DNA identified her. Hobbs, who knew her family, was charged with her murder, but in 2002, a judge dismissed the case due to lack of evidence. Brenda's case remained officially unsolved, though investigators believed Hobbs was responsible. Now, with Holly Ann Campiglia's case, there was a DNA match linking Hobbs to yet another murder. But the Solano County Sheriff's Office wanted to be absolutely certain. They obtained a warrant to collect a new DNA sample directly from Hobbs to compare. The fresh sample was tested against the DNA found at Holly's crime scene 42 years earlier. The results confirmed what investigators had hoped and feared. It was a match. Herman Lee Hobbs' DNA was on evidence recovered from Holly Ann Campiglia. On February 24, 2023, a Solano County Superior Court judge issued an arrest warrant for Herman Lee Hobbs. A removal order was also issued to transfer him from Valley State Prison, where he was serving his existing sentences, to the Solano County Jail. Hobbs was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in connection with Holly's death, with an enhancement for the use of a gun. At 76 years old and already serving life sentences, Hobbs now faced yet another murder charge. The Solano County Sheriff's Office held a press conference to announce the breakthrough. They spoke about how difficult cold cases are to investigate, how time creates gaps in memory, how witnesses die, how evidence degrades. They paid tribute to Deputy Jose Cisneros, the original investigator who had been killed in the line of duty in 1985. His hard work, they said, was still helping solve cases over 40 years later. The evidence he collected, the reports he filed, the procedures he followed had preserved what was needed for justice to eventually be served. The Solano County Sheriff's Office thanked the Campiglia family. They credited their patience, their persistence, their refusal to give up. Without the family's request in 2021 to review the case and resubmit evidence for DNA analysis, Holly's murder might never have been solved. The family turned their grief into action. They lived with uncertainty for over 40 years, but they never stopped believing that the truth could be found. Herman Lee Hobbs pled no contest to the charges. In July 2024, 44 years after Holly's murder, he was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison for her sexual assault and murder. the sentence would run consecutively with the life sentences he was already serving for his other crimes. At his age, and with his existing sentences, Hobbs would almost certainly die in prison. The Solano County Sheriff's Office issued a statement following the sentencing. They acknowledged that Holly's family had suffered tremendously over the past 4 decades. They expressed hope that the sentencing, while it could never bring Holly back, would give the family some measure of peace. The agency also noted that detectives continue to work in collaboration with other Northern California law enforcement agencies to potentially identify and solve additional cases that may be linked to Hobbs. Given his history, his pattern of violence against young women, there may be other victims whose families are still waiting for answers. Holly Ann Campiglia was 21 years old when Herman Lee Hobbs took her life. She was young, far from home, trying to find her way in the world. Instead, she found a predator who shot her multiple times in the head and neck. And April 29, 1981, started as an ordinary day in Mansfield, Ohio. 18-year-old Debra Lee Miller was just 2 months away from graduating from high school. She worked part-time as a waitress at a local coffee shop called Mr. T's while finishing her senior year. She lived in an apartment on West 3rd Street in downtown Mansfield, part of a modest building where neighbors knew each other and passed in the hallways. Debra came from a large family with 8 brothers and sisters. She was building a life, making plans for graduation, thinking about what might come next. On that April morning, maintenance workers entered her apartment and found a scene that would haunt Mansfield for over 4 decades. Debra's body was discovered in her bedroom. She had been beaten to death with household items, including pots, pans, and a stove burner grate. Someone had taken ordinary kitchen items and turned them into murder weapons. The violence was severe and personal. The Mansfield Police Department launched an immediate investigation. They collected evidence from the scene, interviewed neighbors, and canvassed the area for witnesses. One of those neighbors was 26-year-old James Van Est, who lived directly above Debra's apartment. He was questioned multiple times during the initial investigation, but there wasn't enough evidence to tie him to the crime. He told investigators he had chased a homeless man away from Debra's door on the night of the murder. He claimed Debra had invited him inside briefly, but that she was fine when he left. With no physical evidence linking him to the scene and no other leads, Van Est was never arrested. The investigation became complicated by allegations of potential police misconduct. Debra was one of several people from the Mansfield area whose suspicious deaths in the 1980s were examined for possible links to police officers. According to reports that emerged later, there were concerns about relationships between officers and Debra. The revelation raised uncomfortable questions about the investigation. Were officers properly handling the case? Were there conflicts of interest? In 1989, 8 years after Debra's murder, the mayor ordered a special investigation into these allegations. The resulting report concluded there was no evidence linking any officers with the deaths that had been examined. However, questions remained about how some homicides had been investigated during that period. The controversy cast a shadow over the department. The local police chief retired in January 1990 after additional complaints arose. The questions and doubts lingered, but Debra's case remained unsolved. Over the years, Debra's case was reopened several times. New detectives would review the file, examine the evidence, try to find something previous investigators had missed. But each time, the case eventually went cold again. There simply wasn't enough evidence to move forward. The forensic technology available in the 1980s and 90s was limited compared to what would come later. DNA analysis existed, but was not yet the powerful investigative tool it would become. Evidence from Debra's apartment was carefully preserved, stored away, waiting for the day when science might catch up to what had happened in that bedroom on West 3rd Street. In 2021, 40 years after Debra's murder, the Mansfield Police Department reopened her case. Advances in DNA technology had transformed what was possible. Detective Terry Butler and DNA analyst Don Fryback retrieved evidence stored for 40 decades and subjected it to modern analysis. A firm DNA profile emerged from the murder weapons themselves, the pots, pans, and oven grates used to beat her to death. The profile matched James Van Est, the upstairs neighbor questioned in 1981 but never charged. The DNA evidence established proof beyond reasonable doubt that Van Est had committed the murder. In November 2021, police located Van Est living in Canton, Ohio, about 100 miles east of Mansfield. Detective Butler arranged to interview him. When questioned, Van Est admitted that he had lied to investigators during his first interview in 1981. The story about chasing away a homeless man was false. He now told a different story. He claimed that in the early morning hours of April 29th, Debra had invited him into her apartment. He said they had consensual sex. He was trying to establish an alibi, trying to explain why his DNA would be present in her apartment. But investigators had not yet revealed to him what they had found. His attempt to get ahead of the evidence was itself revealing. Detective Butler sensed that Van Est knew the walls were closing in. Richland County Prosecutor Jody Schumacher reviewed the findings and determined that the evidence against Van Est was strong enough to take to a grand jury. They were preparing to seek an indictment for murder. In spring 2024, Detective Butler sought a second interview with Van Est. This time, Van Est refused to speak and requested an attorney. Shortly after that conversation, he took actions that suggested he knew what was coming. He sold his house in Canton. He bought a pickup truck and trailer. He left several firearms at his Canton home and headed to West Virginia with 2 more guns. He was stopped in West Virginia and arrested on state gun charges. He posted bond and was released. The Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Explosives took over his case. They examined the circumstances of his gun possession and determined that federal charges were warranted. Van Est was indicted on federal gun charges. He posted bond again and returned to Ohio. But instead of staying in Canton, he went into hiding. He checked into the Roadway Inn in Jackson Township in Stark County. That's where U.S. Marshals and a SWAT team located him in November 2024. They were there to serve the indictment on the gun charges. When authorities attempted to serve the warrant, Van Est barricaded himself inside the motel room and opened fire. A shootout ensued. 1 SWAT officer was shot in the arm but survived. James Van Est did not survive. He was shot and killed during the exchange of gunfire. On December 30th, 2024, 43 years after Debra's murder, Police Chief Jason Bamman announced the cold case had been solved. James Van Est was definitively identified as Debra's killer. The DNA evidence was conclusive. If Van Est were still alive, there would have been enough evidence to charge him with first-degree murder. Because of his death during the shootout, there would be no trial, but the case was closed. Chief Bamman expressed hope that identifying Debra's killer would bring her family some measure of closure. Detective Butler spoke at the press conference as well. He noted that his great-uncle was one of the first officers on the scene of Debra's murder back in 1981. He said he felt fortunate to get the chance to solve a homicide that had happened when he was just 10 years old. His message to the public was clear: law enforcement doesn't give up. They keep digging. The resolution of Debra's case underscores the power of modern forensic science and investigator persistence. Evidence stored for 40 years revealed its secrets through DNA analysis that didn't exist when Debra was killed. The profile pointed to the man who lived upstairs, who had been questioned and walked away. For 43 years, James Van Est lived with what he had done, while Debra's family lived with questions. Debra Lee Miller was 18 years old when her life was stolen. She was weeks away from graduating high school, on the verge of adulthood and all the possibilities it held. Instead, she became a cold case that haunted a community for over 4 decades. Her killer lived free for all those years, dying in a shootout rather than in handcuffs. There was no courtroom justice, no moment where he had to face what he had done. But there were answers. After 43 years, Debra's family finally knew. The case was closed.